Welcome to another bar walkthrough video from SuperfastCPA. I'm Logan, and in today's video, we're going to be going over bar area 3. This is section C2, and this is an application topic. Calculate the fund balances, including assigned, unassigned, non-spendable, committed, and restricted for state and local governments, and prepare journal entries. And we're going to be doing that the SuperfastCPA way, which is diving straight into the questions to learn the material. Now, if you don't know much about our strategies, make sure you go to SuperfastCPA.com and sign up for our free 1-hour webinar training. In that 1 hour, that is free, we will teach you the key ingredients to passing the CPA exam so you don't waste months or even years of your time failing exams. And after you watch that, you're going to want to learn more, so make sure you also check out becoming a Superfast CPA Pro member or buying the Superfast CPA additional study materials or getting the total bundle, which includes all of that together. And one of the great things that you can get by getting the total bundle or the study materials is the full versions of these videos that we're doing right here. So in today's video, we're only going to be doing 5 questions. But if you get the total bundle or if you get the study materials for the specific section that you're studying for, you will get access to the full 10 question versions of these videos so that you can get a little bit more help and a little bit more understanding. Now, right now, those 10 question versions are actually part of the pro course, but we are planning on changing that pretty soon. So that's why I'm saying it's going to be part of the study materials. At any rate, now that we have that intro, let's go ahead and dive into the questions for this video. All right, here we are at question 1. And something I want to say at the beginning of this video is in the previous video, we talked about calculating similar things to what we're talking about in this video, but we were doing it for net position. In this video, we are doing it for fund balance, which is a little bit different, but it's still in the government realm. So let's dive into question 1. The first thing that I always like to point out is that you want to read the last sentence of the question first. This is a very good test day taking strategy because on test day, you have no idea what you're going to be seeing. You have no idea what the questions are going to be. So being in the habit of reading that last sentence first very frequently will give you context for what you're dealing with or tell you the actual question that you're supposed to be answering. Again, it's not 100% of the time, but it is a really good habit. So let's do it right here. What amount should the city report as non-spendable fund balance? Again, imagine you were on the exam or in the exam on test day and you read that last sentence. City report as non-spendable fund balance. Now, because you've been studying for weeks or maybe even months, you should have an idea of non-spendable. That's something to do with the government, and fund balance. Okay, yes, we're definitely dealing with the government. So now you have an idea of what you're dealing with in this question. So let's go up to the top. A city's general fund reports total assets of $218,000 and total liabilities of $71,000. Included in the assets are $18,000 of inventory and $9,000 of prepaid insurance. The remaining assets are available to be used for current spending. So what amount should they report as non-spendable fund balance? So if you have any idea what non-spendable fund balance is, that's great. Maybe give this a try. Maybe pause the video and give it a good guess. Or honestly, you could probably read through this and kind of reason your way to the correct answer. But throughout this video, we are going to be learning about the different pieces of fund balance and how to calculate them. Namely, in this question, we're learning about non-spendable fund balance. So if you know how to do this, great. If not, let's go ahead and take a look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is D, $27,000. So let's go through this. This is the first piece of fund balance. Fund balance is the difference between a governmental fund's assets and liabilities, or essentially its equity. In simple terms, it shows what resources are left in the fund after liabilities are subtracted. Those remaining sources are then classified into categories based on how available they are and what limits exist on their use. So overall, fund balance is basically just the equity in these different pieces of the government financial statements. But now we're going to learn about the different distinctions in fund balance. So let's go to non-spendable fund balance. Non-spendable fund balance includes amounts that cannot be spent because they are not in spendable form, like inventory, or because they are legally or contractually required to stay intact, like maybe principal in a permanent fund. So those would be the 2 examples of non-spendable things. Things that literally you can't spend as money for anything because it's either inventory, so it's not cash, or you cannot use it because it's the principal in a permanent fund. Because if you did, then that would basically, ruin the rules of the permanent fund, and we're not going to talk about that right now. Anyway, as mentioned, inventory and prepaid insurance are not spendable cash or financial resources. They are assets, but the government cannot use them to pay current bills. So even though they're assets, they are not spendable assets. So that's why we're adding them together, $18,000 of inventory plus $9,000 of prepaid insurance, equaling $27,000 of non-spendable fund balance. So again, this is the first piece of fund balance. So the first piece is non-spendable. Now let's go to the next question to learn the next thing after non-spendable. Okay, here we are at question 2. What amount should the city report as restricted fund balance? Okay, so this is a different piece of fund balance. Let's go up to the top. A city's special revenue fund reports total fund balance of $284,000 at year end. Of that amount, $37,000 relates to prepaid items. State law requires $96,000 to be used only for road repairs. The City Council has set aside $58,000 for future park improvements, but the Council could change that decision if needed. So again, out of all this information, how are we going to know what the amount is for the restricted fund balance? Now, based on what you might have learned in the previous video, if you watched it about net position, you might have a little bit of an understanding about restricted because it's fairly similar between net position and fund balance. But if you have no idea how to calculate this or how to figure this out, that's okay. We're using these questions to learn. If you want to give this a try, pause the video and do it on your own. But if not, let's go ahead and take a look at the answer together. All right, here we are at the answer. C, $96,000 is the amount that would be the restricted fund balance. So let's go through this. After non-spendable fund balance, which again is things that are literally not in a spendable form, the other 4 categories are generally spendable resources. So they can be spent, but then there's going to be different restrictions. The difference is the level of constraint placed on the money, like I just said. Restricted fund balance is spendable, but it can only be spent for a specific purpose because the restriction comes from outside the government or from law. Here, the $96,000 required by state law to be used for road repairs is restricted fund balance. The city can spend the money, but only for road repairs. That is different from prepaid items, which are non-spendable, like we just learned, and different from the City Council's park set-aside, which is an internal decision, and we'll learn about how to distinguish that in the next questions. But we learned in this question, after non-spendable, the next is restricted. And restricted means that it can be spent, but only on a very specific thing, and that restriction is set up by something outside of the government, like a law or some other entity. So that's the second piece of fund balance. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 3. What amount should the city report as committed fund balance? So this is the third piece, committed. Let's go up to the top. A city's general fund reports total fund balance of $412,000 at year end. Of that amount, $52,000 is inventory, $118,000 is restricted by state law for public safety programs, and $74,000 has been formally set aside by City Council ordinance for construction of a new community center. The City Council is the highest, or the city's highest level of decision-making authority, and the ordinance would have to be changed by another ordinance. So again, how much is committed fund balance? Now, just based on the context of this question, you might be able to figure this out. But if you don't know what committed is, again, that's okay. We're learning each piece of the puzzle through these questions. So we've learned about non-spendable, restricted. Now we're going to learn about committed. If you want to give this a try, go ahead and pause the video. If not, let's go ahead and take a look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is B, $74,000. So let's go through this. This will all start making sense, the levels of restriction. Committed fund balance is spendable, just like restricted, but the government has placed a strong internal constraint on how the money can be used. The key is that the constraint must come from the government's highest level of decision-making authority, such as the City Council, County Commission, or a similar governing body. Committed fund balance is different from restricted fund balance because the constraint is internal, not external. Restricted fund balance comes from an outside source, such as state law, grant requirements, creditors, or other external parties like we just learned. Committed fund balance comes from the government itself, but through a formal action that is not easy to undo. So still really restricted, still for a very specific purpose, but the government is the one who set it apart, compared to restricted would be if it was an external party. Here, the $74,000 set aside by City Council ordinance for a new community center is committed fund balance. The City Council is the highest decision-making authority, and the commitment can only be changed by another formal ordinance. So it's very strict, but again, it was internal. The $52,000 of inventory, as we've learned, is non-spendable, and the $118,000 required by state law is restricted, as we learned in the previous question. So we've learned 3 levels so far: non-spendable, restricted, and committed. Now let's go to the next question. Okay, here we are at question 4. What amount should the city report as assigned fund balance? So again, just the next level. Let's go up to the top. A city's general fund reports total fund balance of $365,000 at year end. Of that amount, $41,000 is inventory, $89,000 is restricted by a state grant for public health programs, and $67,000 was formally committed by City Council ordinance for debt service. The city's finance director has also set aside $38,000 for planned technology upgrades. City policy allows the finance director to assign fund balance for specific purposes, so he's allowed to do this. In addition, the city has $24,000 of outstanding purchase orders for office equipment at year end. The city council has not formally committed the amount related to the purchase orders. Okay, so a bit more information going on here. We need to figure out how much is assigned. We've learned 3 steps though so far. We've learned about non-spendable, restricted, and committed. So you could probably look through this, figure out what amounts are non-spendable, restricted, or committed, and that will probably help you get closer to, or maybe even get the right answer for the assigned fund balance. So I would say at this point, pause the video, try this on your own because we've learned quite a bit so far. And when you're ready, come back, we'll look at the answer together to learn more about assigned fund balance. Okay, here we are. The answer is C, $62,000. So let's go through this. This is kind of summing up everything we've learned so far, putting it all together so you can kind of see how it works together. Assigned fund balance is spendable, like the previous 2 that we've learned, but the government intends to use it for a specific purpose, so it's still kind of set aside. The constraint is weaker than committed fund balance because it does not require formal action by the government's highest decision-making authority. Assigned fund balance can come from the governing body itself or from an official who has been given authority to make assignments. Here, the $38,000 set aside by the finance director for technology upgrades is assigned fund balance because city policy gives the finance director authority to assign fund balance. The $24,000 of outstanding purchase orders is also assigned because it represents resources intended for a specific purchase, and the city council has not formally committed that amount. So there's a key difference there. Outstanding purchase orders, or things similar to it, they will either be assigned or committed, but it depends on the level of the intended use. Like if it was committed by the city council, then the outstanding purchase orders would be counted in the committed amount of fund balance. But in this case, since the city council did not formally commit that amount, it's going to be counted as assigned. But again, that's one additional piece that can be included here is the outstanding purchase orders. So we have $38,000 plus $24,000. Outstanding encumbrances at year end usually show up as either committed or assigned fund balance, as I was just saying. If the encumbrance is tied to a formal action by the highest level of authority, it may be committed. If it is simply showing intent to use resources for a specific purpose, it is usually assigned. So the assigned fund balance is the $38,000 of technology upgrades plus, I don't know how that plus sign ended up there. That's all right. Or that equals sign, excuse me. $38,000 technology upgrades plus $24,000 of outstanding purchase orders equals $62,000 of assigned fund balance. Okay, so we learned the 4th piece so far. So we've learned non-spendable, restricted, committed, and now assigned. And it does go kind of in order, like in a level of almost hierarchy, if you want to say it like that. So assigned is similar to committed. It's just an internal restriction by the government, but it's not so formal or so strict as committed would be. Committed is, again, from the highest level of authority. Assigned is not, but again, it's still internal restriction by the government. Okay, so we've learned 4 of the pieces. Now let's go to the last piece of the fund balance. All right, here we are at question 5. What amount should the city report as unassigned fund balance in the general fund? Okay, let's go up to the top. A city reports the following fund balances at year end. General fund, total fund balance is $338,000. Non-spendable fund balance, $46,000. Restricted fund balance, $82,000. Committed fund balance, $71,000. And assigned fund balance, $54,000. The city also reports a special revenue fund with total balances of $96,000, all of which is restricted for public library programs. Okay, so how much of the fund balance is going to be unassigned? If I'm honest, now that we've learned everything else about fund balance, this probably shouldn't be too difficult. I would bet money that you could pause the video, think through this, and figure it out fairly easily. So go ahead and do that. Pause the video, figure out this question, and when you're ready, come back. We'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is B, $85,000. Again, you probably were able to figure that out just based on everything we've learned so far. Let's go through this. Again, this is the final piece of fund balance, unassigned fund balance. Unassigned fund balance is the leftover spendable fund balance that has not been placed into one of the other categories. In the general fund, a positive unassigned fund balance means the government has resources available for general use. These resources are not non-spendable, restricted, committed, or assigned. The general fund is the only fund that can report a positive unassigned fund balance. Other governmental funds, such as special revenue funds, capital projects funds, and debt service funds, normally exist for a specific purpose. Because of that, their positive fund balances should usually be classified as restricted, committed, or assigned, not unassigned. So again, just to make sure that's clear, the general fund can have a positive unassigned amount because that just means they have money that they have there that's not assigned to anything yet, and it can be used for general use. But for other funds like special revenue, capital projects, or debt service funds, they rarely are going to have just money sitting around. They are built for a specific purpose, so there's really not ever going to be a positive unassigned amount in those kinds of funds because the whole point of them is to always have something assigned for a specific purpose. So they're not really ever going to have a positive unassigned balance. Let's keep going. The general fund unassigned fund balance is calculated as follows. So you would take the total fund balance at the beginning, $338,000, subtract the non-spendable, subtract the restricted, subtract the committed, and subtract the assigned, and that gives you $85,000 of unassigned fund balance. Pretty easy. It's really just what's left over, especially when it comes to the general fund. A negative unassigned fund balance can happen in another governmental fund. It usually happens when the fund has overspent the resources available for its specific purpose. So positive unassigned fund balance belongs only in the general fund, but negative unassigned fund balance can appear in other governmental funds. You don't need to dive super deep into that specific piece of this, but just remember that the general fund is the only one that can have a positive unassigned fund balance, and then the other ones can have negative because maybe they overspent. But the main thing you need to know from this is how to calculate unassigned fund balance, which really, again, is just the leftover fund balance after non-spendable, restricted, committed, and assigned. So we've learned the 5 pieces of calculating fund balance for the different funds in the government that use fund balance, because remember, in the previous video, there are some that use net position, but overall, that's what we needed to know. So before we do anything else, let's do one more part of the Superfast CPA process called pillar topics. All right. Now, as a reminder, the idea behind pillar topics is as you're going through the questions to learn the material, you will notice the things that keep popping up throughout the questions. You've seen the same concept 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 times. You've seen the same equation or the same idea multiple times, and you take that out in your own words as the pillar topic or the key point that you needed to know from the questions so that you can kind of be amassing the most important things you need to know for the exam from the questions. So let's go ahead and look at the pillar topics for this video. All right, here we are at the pillar topics. Let's just dive straight in. Just as a reminder, again, these are basically the summary of the most important things we needed to learn. First off, non-spendable fund balance includes resources that cannot be spent because they are not in spendable form, such as inventory or prepaid items. It can also include amounts legally or contractually required to remain intact, like principal in a permanent fund. And don't get confused by that restriction, because all the other things have restrictions except for unassigned, but they can be spent. Whereas non-spendable means that either can't be spent because it's not in a form that can be spent, or the restriction is you cannot spend this money. So that's why it's called non-spendable. Let's go to the next one. Restricted fund balance is spendable, but only for a specific purpose because the limitation comes from an outside source or from law. Examples include grant requirements, creditor restrictions, or state law requirements. Next is committed fund balance, and this is also spendable, but the government has formally limited its use through action by its highest level of decision-making authority. The commitment must be removed or changed through the same type of formal action. So again, this is internal, but it's an internal limit that is by the highest level of decision-making authority. That is what distinguishes it from assigned, which we'll talk about now. Assigned fund balance is spendable, just like the other two, but the government intends to use it for a specific purpose. This is a weaker constraint than committed fund balance and may include outstanding encumbrances that have not been formally committed. And by the way, outstanding encumbrances, as a reminder, can also be part of committed if those outstanding encumbrances are set aside by the highest level of decision-making authority. So again, assigned is different than committed. They're both internal restrictions, but committed is the highest level of authority. Assigned is just, set aside by the government, not by the highest level of authority or even by somebody who's been given the authority to set aside this amount. And finally, there is unassigned fund balance, which is the leftover spendable amount that has not been classified as non-spendable, restricted, committed, or assigned in the general fund. The general fund is the only fund that can report a positive unassigned fund balance, but other governmental funds can report negative unassigned fund balance. And we talked a little bit about that. Again, that point isn't something you need to know super, super deeply, but just remember that the idea is unassigned fund balance is what's left over, especially in the general fund, and the general fund is the only one that's going to have a positive amount because the other governmental funds have a specific purpose, so it's really unlikely, or basically it's not going to happen where they have just money sitting around in an unassigned fund balance. Most of their stuff is going to be restricted, committed, or assigned. So with all that, we learned a lot in these 5 questions and in these pillar topics. Now, as a reminder, that is the end of this YouTube version of the video. We only went over those, but if you liked this, make sure you check out becoming a SuperFast CPA member by getting the total bundle or buying our study materials, because you will get access to the full 10-question versions of these videos for whatever study material you purchase, and you can get a little bit more help and a little bit more understanding. So again, check out becoming a member of SuperFast CPA, and the easiest way to do that is by going to superfastcpa.com and signing up for our free 1-hour webinar training. We'll teach you the key ingredients to passing the CPA exam, and from there, you'll have a much better path and understanding for getting the total bundle or getting the pro course or getting the study materials. And remember, the total bundle is the study materials and the pro course. You get both of them. So again, make sure you check all that out. Now, with that, thanks for watching this video. I hope that you liked it. If you did, make sure to leave a like and a comment in the YouTube video. And with that said, I'll see you in the next video.